The Olympics is a heavily politically interviewed sports event. It is a demonstration of national power and an event where countries come together to play a fair game and emphasize on universal values. Very proud to propose this motion. A few bits of framing before I start with the arguments. We believe that the Olympics is a demonstration of national power. This is true due to several reasons. We see that countries bidding for the Olympics to promote their own country. We also see the tally counts for countries' medals, such as how many medals, say, Team USA has, or how many medals Russia has in the past, right? We also see that they have flag bearers and cultural shows in the opening ceremony. And instead of remembering and saying the athletes' names during the commentary, you say, for example, Team Finland or Team USA. This ultimately shows that the Olympics is more politically oriented than any other sports event. We also believe that it is an event where countries come together to promote a universal known value, which is fairness. And we also condone each other's behaviors by agreeing each other to play fairly in a sports event. Now, I would like to give a preemption that the opposition side would obviously say that the proposition side banning competitors from certain countries would ultimately means that we're depriving certain individuals the rights of competing in an event. Two responses to this. The first response is that this would be true in other cases when individuals actually represent themselves in other sports events, such as Formula One or ATP tennis. But in this case, we're talking about the Olympics, where individuals, instead of representing themselves, they represent the countries. Meaning that accepting Russia into the Olympics basically means that we universally condone what Putin is doing is universally acceptable. And we believe that the Olympics and the IOC definitely do not want to promote this ideology. Now, we get this away. I would like to move on to the first argument on how we can prevent sports washing in the Olympics. Three layers I want to talk about under this argument. The first layer is, why is it justified to ban certain countries that have committed huge crimes against humanities in Olympic events? Two things I want to talk about under this layer. The first thing is that the Olympics is extremely influential. It has global recognition. It has millions of fans and spectators each year. And it's basically the most important basically the most important actor in sports are fans, because they are the ones that actually, watch these events and having a huge passion when they watch these events. So they hold a lot of influence on places such as social media, and some people are really invested that they would spend every inch of their time to focus on the Olympics and go to places such as Paris to watch it live, right? The second thing I want to talk about is that the Olympic also represent honor. So you gain recognition for your country, you also get glorification for your country once you win a medal. Moving on to the second layer then, why is this important? We believe that countries that committed huge crimes against humanities would ultimately use Olympics to divert attention away from their wrongdoings. This means that the exposure towards the achievement of the athletes can ultimately divert people's focus away from the crimes or the wrongdoings the countries are currently doing, right? For example, during the Qatar World Cup, all you talk about is Messi, Ronaldo, and every famous footballers, but you're not actually focusing on how the Qatar government is abusing labor force to build the stadium, or how Saudi Arabian countries are usually doing things that are not politically correct and abusive towards humanities. This is just an example to how easily it is for a country to divert their crimes against humanities by just holding a very influential sports event. The implication is that the hype of talking about human right abuses die out, and you kind of lose awareness over this certain issue and this certain crime that is currently taking place. And when people think of Qatar, they now wouldn't think of the bad deeds that the countries are doing or did in the past. Instead, they would think about they would think about like the amazing sport events this country is currently holding. But before I move on to the third layer, yes, go ahead.
Before the Qatar World Cup, wasn't it like even less likely that people knew about the human rights abuses? Like they probably didn't even know Qatar existed. Doesn't sport then offer a platform to actually expose this?
I don't think the sport actually provides a platform for people to voice out their concerns, right? Because obviously, Qatar has already has human rights issues, and I think most people would know, like if you're living around that region, and I think in most cases, it's very unlikely for the countries to simply just like cover all their human rights issues just by uh not holding a sports event. But in this case, when they hold an Olympic game, or imagine if Russia holds an Olympic game, obviously people are all just going to talk about how Russia is holding this Olympic game this year. They're not going to focus on the crimes that they have been actively inflicting upon humans or the crimes that they have committed before. So obviously, the center of attention wouldn't be the mistakes that the countries have made in the past. Instead, the center would be diverted into the current sport events that they're holding. So that's the point that I want to make. Moving on to the fourth layer, then, why it is extremely harmful. The reason why it is extremely harmful is because it goes against the principle of Olympics, as I have stated in my framing, right? Because it's no longer fair, and because the country has already harmed the humanity of other people. You do not deserve the honors because you simply violated the basic principles of humanity. This is very important because the Olympics is a very politically oriented event, and having countries competing in it basically means that countries kind of implicitly agree or believe that what each other are currently doing is universally acceptable. We also believe that it is pretty unfair for the victims, right? Because you suddenly you divert the awareness of the victims to having a sports event, or you divert the attention of what the victims of your crimes against humanity, and now people only focus about the sport events. This means that the victims now do not have an opportunity to voice out for themselves. Due to all of these reasons, we're extremely proud to propose this motion. Thank you.
Owo agrees that crimes against humanity are incredibly horrible. However, we don't think isolating countries from the international stage is the correct way to address this. A few pieces of setup, framing a few responses, and then moving on to points. Firstly, in terms of setup, as I flagged in my introduction, crimes against humanity are obviously horrible. On OO, I don't think that our burden is to defend allowing sports people who actively condone these actions, who are like involved in these actions, to, for example, participate in these events. We don't think we have to defend that. Instead, we think that we just need to defend allowing sports people who, for example, aren't directly involved, who show no like intent of supporting their government's actions. We think that is fine, and we would support allowing them to participate, right? But secondly, we'd also just say in many of these states, they are often led by dictators that operate on strongman narratives, that promote nationalist ideals and are incredibly patriotic. We think when you isolate them from the world stage, that has irreversible impacts on these countries. Furthermore, a piece of framing. We would say the gesture of allowing countries to participate is like largely symbolic, right? And it doesn't really like bring about meaningful change in these regimes. However, we will talk about the massive practical benefit when you do not allow, when you actually allow them to participate because they no longer feel humiliated. A few responses. The first claim is to say that when you play against these teams and when you allow them to participate, no thank you, you immediately condone their actions. That is just simply not true for the reason that often activism can occur throughout sports, right? Consider in the Premier League where lots of pro-Ukrainian messages are being shown at matches, but we don't necessarily ban all Russian players just because they might be like from Russian heritage, right? We think that that is perfectly fine. We do not necessarily have to condone actions when you play against them. The second thing that they talk about is how this leads to sports washing, because they say that this global recognition and glorification when you win a medal exists. The problem is, Firstly, most of these countries do not win lots of medals. But secondly, we would just say that like this actually brings up a platform in order to, for example, bring up lots of the abuses as I flagged in my POI, right? Like obviously the Olympics will always divert some amount of attention, like regardless of whether these countries participate or not, because like Messi or Ronaldo is always going to exist. However, if they do not participate, you do not get any discourse. The participation is likely to be like controversial to some extent. You don't get that coverage. No, thank you. So moving on to a point. Firstly, on how this is so unfair. Secondly, it hurts national unity. Thirdly, worsens the situation in these countries. The first thing we would note under this principle is that it is super unfair for lots of different stakeholders, right? That looks like, for example, the sports players who have trained for incredibly long periods of time. It looks like the fans who cannot unite around their common athlete. It looks like, for example, the country as a whole not being able to have that national spirit, right? We would say that for the majority of sports players, it is definitely not their fault that these actions have occurred, because we would say in many instances, we would just say in many instances, it is a birth lottery that condemns them to be born in this country. It is unfair that you suddenly don't allow them to participate. But as I flagged in my introduction, we don't necessarily have to defend a world where we don't have to defend allowing sports players who actively condone the actions of their government to participate. We thought that banning these particular stakeholder was fine. Yes, I'll take you now.
If my principal murdered a student, should we let him deliver the graduation address?
We would say no, obviously, because the principal is we would say we wouldn't allow him to deliver the graduation address because he's immoral. But this is like not a comparable analogy, right? For the reason that we're not letting the dictator participate in the sports event. We're allowing other individuals who might be associated with him to participate in the event. Just as, for example, we would still allow like the school captain who just because he happens to go to that school doesn't mean we don't allow the school captain to not deliver that like end of year speech either, right? So we don't think this analogy was comparable. We think that this was actually incredibly unfair in that instance, and we're able to flip that example, explain why it was unfair. We would say then it is also unfair because, for example, events from a long time ago, it makes it's unclear how long ago would be considered not long enough to move on from that instance. We thought there were lots of different principal concerns. Instead, it was much better that we allowed them to participate. We didn't deprive people of the opportunity of participating just because they were born in a certain place. We thought that was so unfair. Secondly, how this hurts citizens in these countries and hurts the national unity of these countries. And the piece of framing we don't hear is that in post-conflict societies where these atrocities have been committed, the country is incredibly divided. Often there's, for example, ethnic conflict, and so there's division on ethnic lines, and often they are reeling from the effects of this conflict and from these atrocities. What is incredibly important then, Judge, in this debate was national unity, because you are able to smooth over the cracks and disagreements. And so when you allow them to participate in major sports competitions like the Olympics, they're able to unite behind this one sports player. They're able to, for example, get that help. They are able to feel proud of their country, and they no longer feel divided along those ethnic lines because they were all cheering for their country, right? And sport is a great way to do this. It helps build that common sense of unity that is often necessary for the society to progress. In the comparative, they are locked out of the competition, they stay divided. Finally, how does this worsen the situation in these countries? Firstly, we would say that this legitimizes the narrative of rogue states that the world is against them, because often these governments build the narrative that they're being isolated. And when you, for example, actively isolate the country, this helps fuel patriotic sentiment, right? And this makes citizens in these countries resent the West even more, and it builds and almost legitimizes the government within these countries, right? Particularly when the governments use rhetoric and they point to other countries who are allowed to participate and say, hey, why were they allowed to participate? They did this as well, right? And we think fans are likely to engage in a lot of backlash because they feel like it's unfair that they're not allowed to participate. They feel like they're being targeted. That is so bad for these countries. But secondly, if it's out of order, we think this prevents discourse from these countries, because often we would say sports is a great way to allow us to expose many of the issues in these countries. Athletes often voice their concerns on the world stage. Now you no longer allow them to do that. But secondly, we'd also just say often it is likely to be controversial. Often journalists go into these countries and they expose lots of things. The example that OG gives about the World Cup works against them, because in a world before the World Cup, there was no understanding of these Qatari human rights abuses. Then, for example, through the process of this sports event, because it got so much coverage, at least some of that coverage was diverted to attention towards these critical issues, right? But thirdly, we think this creates a horrible signaling effect that everyone in the country, even like athletes and fans, are somehow associated with the regime because they are banned from participating in this competition. And this rhetoric reduces the capital in the West to try help that country, and it makes it so much worse. This was a policy that would be unfair for so many stakeholders. It would worsen national unity, but moreover, it would worsen the political situation in these countries. For those reasons.
Three major pieces of responses before going on to my 2 pieces of weighing on which side actually is more harmful towards, which side actually is more harmful, but secondly, on which side can actually raise awareness towards these kind of crimes against humanity. So firstly, onto my first piece of response on how opening opposition says that they don't want isolation towards certain countries. Yes, I think it's unfair to a certain extent, but the reason why we're willing to bite the bullet is simply because the Olympics isn't simply about representing yourself, but about representing your own country, right? You can see this from how when you get a medal, people usually remember you as, oh, Team USA got a medal instead of the athlete's name who got the medal, right? I think this in itself just proves that the honor you get isn't simply for yourself, because people oftentimes do not remember you. They simply pin the honor you get onto your country. But the reason why we're willing to bite the bullet is simply because we believe that these countries who committed these crimes against humanity are undeserving of these kind of honors. This is why we're willing to bite the bullet. But secondly, on how they try to say, oh, these countries who are isolated are probably going to feel targeted. They're probably going to pin the blame back onto these Western countries. I think one is just largely untrue, right? Because when you actually, as a citizen, when you actually see your favorite athlete and able to compete in the Olympics, you're probably gonna feel a certain amount of resentment towards your government, right? Because you know it's because of your government who committed some kind of human abuses that your favorite athlete cannot go and participate in these kinds in the Olympics. I think this in itself just means that you have more awareness, because people actually feel resentment towards the government. You give them an active motivation to fight against the government. You tell them to hold themselves accountable. I think these are things that are way more likely to happen under our Senate House. But secondly, I also want to point out that it's unlikely that under your Senate House you can help feel patriotic sentiments, because I think one, it's just unlikely that these countries are gonna listen to your citizens anyway. But also two, when you actively see yourself getting banned out from
point of information.
No, thank you. When you actively see, even if your country's athlete are able to participate in the Olympics, even if they get a medal, there's probably still going to be a certain level of condemnation from other nations. There's probably still going to be people calling out Israel for a lot of war crimes. You do not get the honor you ought to deserve in the first place anyway. I think it's still way more harmful for these citizens and their countries, because they still see that they're not getting the honor they ought to deserve in the first place. But three, on how they say, oh, athletes are able to voice out their concerns. I think this is just largely untrue, because when you are representing your own country who committed war crimes, your government is probably going to stop you from calling out human rights abuses, right? Because it means that you're going to call out your own government. I think this just means that you cut down on the influence of these athletes who can bring awareness to these kind of issues, because oftentimes you see athletes who are activists for human rights. I think under opposition, these athletes are unable to call out these kind of abuses simply because you have to represent your own country. Your government is going to stop you from doing so. The comparative is that under our Senate House, when you no longer always have to represent your country, but you represent yourself as an individual, this is when you actually have way more ability to call these kind of abuses. This is when you actually raise more awareness, because you can use your influence as an athlete. Before moving on to weighing, yes.
Do you think that countries that in the past have committed crimes against humanity but no longer commit them, do you think that these types of countries should still not be able to deserve any honors or recognition on the internet?
I think these kind of things have a time frame, right? For example, North Korea used to be banned out from the Olympics. There's a lot of countries who committed war crimes who are banned out, but are now allowed to participate simply because these war crimes are over, or maybe they have compensated for them already, right? I think these things exist on a time frame. You do not ban them for, I don't know, for like forever, right? So then moving on to my two pieces of weighing. Firstly, on why under opposition is way more harmful under their set house. I think the main reason why is because you undermine the legitimacy of the Olympics as being the most honorable event, the most honorable sports event, right? Because the Olympics is supposed to be the most honorable event in sports. This just means that you have to be like most humane. You have to care about a variety of different issues. For example, the Paris Olympics is quite eco-friendly, right? Because you want to present yourself as like worthy of being the most honorable event. I think to a certain extent, this also means that you ought to call out the country who abuse human rights, right? So in our instance, this means like banning these countries who have committed crimes against humanity to participate in the Olympics. But I think what happens under opposition side then is simply because by allowing these countries to still have the opportunity to get these kind of honors that they do not deserve in the first place, you're undermining the legitimacy of the Olympics as being advocates of human rights or as being the most honorable sports event. I think the reason why this is extremely harmful is because you also at the same time take away the honor of other countries, right? Because when the honor of Olympics was not as good as it used to be, also impact a lot more other countries, you impact other athletes, you're taking away the honor that they ought to receive in the first place. We say that's just way more harmful than stopping a few athletes from these countries who committed war crimes to participate in the first place. But then onto my second clash on which side actually raises awareness. I think the reason why opposition loses and opposition side loses this clash is simply because they do not provide an extra way for people to raise awareness, right? I think the reason why this is only exclusive under our Senate House is because you can only under our Senate House provide an active motivation for people to call out these governments, because it also means that you're banning your favorite athletes or athletes who deserve to be in the Olympics from participating in the first place. We think the reason why this is extremely important is because it's quite influential, right? Because athletes have a lot of fans. These fans are not only just view them as their idols, but sometimes they also tie their own identity to them, right? So for example, if your favorite athlete got an Olympic medal, you're gonna be really happy for them. I think these are all emotions that motivate these fans to call out these governments or call these countries. We say these kinds of awareness only exist under our Senate House for all these reasons above, so proud to propose.
Chair, when opposition reduces their case to mere virtue signaling and using vague words like the honor of the countries and the honor of other countries without providing a world where this actual direct and practical change would occur in their world, and without providing any reason on how the problem of actual human rights violations in Gaza and Ukraine would actually change in their world, they have lost the debate, because we provide you practical consideration that you ought to consider here, right? But let's actually move on to what OO says about regarding whether or not this is principally fair or this is principally obligated of these international sporting of the Olympics Committee to do so. We tell you what we hear from opening governments is that these individuals represent the country as a whole and not themselves, and therefore they should be banned from these competitions. We give to you three responses. First of all, we already told you at first speaker that individuals are unable to choose who to represent or what country to represent, because a lot of these individuals live under something called an autocracy, which means they're unable to, for example, endorse certain values over other values, meaning it's unfair to punish them for something they're unable to express. But second of all, it's also significantly unclear whether or not people or the audience in general remembers you for your country as opposed to who you are as a person, as opposed to the sporting spirit that you have demonstrated as a person. People probably remember who Michael Phelps and Usain Bolt is as a person rather than the country they come from, right? But third of all, this is just significantly problematic, right? Because you're literally signaling that every single individual, every single athlete, every single citizen here is, as opposition says themselves, essentially complicit and representative of the human rights violations of the crimes against humanity. That they probably have either no idea what's going on, they have no idea of how to change it. That's problematic, because now you're signaling these people as complicit in a crime which they may not necessarily be complicit of. That's something fundamentally unclear. the way here you should suggest, as opposed to, for example, our argumentation as to it's unfair to like deprive these people when opportunity they have changed all their life, is that first of all, opposition provide no link as to competitors competing to like endorsing an actual like country and their policies. But second of all, we tell you that we ought to consider like the vulnerable people who actually are affected in a practical level by this, people who try like for tens of years trying really hard, and then these people will be told they are deprived of such opportunity. The second response I tell you is that it's unfair to implicitly support something. We give you two responses. First of all, there's something called, we just simply boycott. And we tell you that boycotting is probably more salient when a country who actually competes in the competition is faced with that significant amount of boycott, when a country's president who attends the Olympics is faced with people telling him to step down or things like that, right? But second of all, we just tell you that this is fundamentally unfair, right? Because we tell you that in the status quo, that the countries who have been punished with, for example, being banned from the Olympics is typically countries who are against Western values. For example, Russia being punished for the invasion of Ukraine, but like the United States for the invasion of Iraq. This means that this is something that's fundamentally unfair, that this is something that's being disproportionately used against certain countries over others, which makes it even more unfair. Ultimately, you should believe on the principle front, which opposition tried to gain the most lead over, is something that actually outside is able to win upon. Let's move on to what we tell you on the practical front end. First of all, we tell you that this diverts. We hear from opening governments that this diverts people's focus, and this is a form of sports washing. We have three responses. First of all, we just simply flip this argument, right? We tell you that this results in more focus because empirically, in examples of Qatar, which opposition unstrategically uses as an example, the abuse of migrant workers and the reports of that spiked during the FIFA World Cup. People knew more about the abuses of Qatar during the World Cup. But even if you don't believe that, here's a few structured reasons to suggest why that is the case. First of all, things such as journalism and investigative journalism are far more likely to engage in, for example, the acts of smaller countries where it's far more profitable, where people are focused more on it, right? But second of all, the issue is probably more salient where people actually come and see the abuse that's occurring to these workers, whereas the people come and see the abuse that occurs and it's spread to other people through social media and stuff like that. But third of all, just interactions and the interaction and exchange perspectives allow people to see what they're doing is wrong. I think this is important because we flip this and we tell you that there's probably more focus when it's actual participation within these countries, right? But third response is that this is unclear how this actually translates to more change, right? It is unclear when more or less focus actually translates to change from side or opening government, even if they argue that is the most important, right? We tell you that change actually occurs in our world, as I will explain later on. But before I move on, any POIs?
People know that not everyone is complacent. Like a random woman in the middle of woods in Russia probably is not the one out killing. People are smart enough.
Yes, but we tell you that exactly, right? And it's probably unclear why somebody who's an athlete, who's not engaging in, for example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is complicit in such act. It is unclear why that person should be punished. It is unclear why that person is a representation of that country. People know that they are the representation of that country. And obviously, people won't think that the Olympic Committee is endorsing such values. What else we hear from opening government? Opening government also says that Olympics is a demonstration of national power for these countries. However, first of all, we just heard that this is non-exclusive because, for example, you can also engage in like military parades. You can also engage in a greater show of force through like military exercises and stuff like that. We probably argue these demonstrations of national power, once the ability to engage in sports events is taken, that will probably exist and that is probably worse. But second of all, we tell you, yes, the national power is challenged in opposition as well. Let's say that is the case, but that's worse because this results in the humiliation of that country. Countries fear that if they do bend down to like sanctions and punishment, and if they do appear weak, then that means additional leverage of even more and worse punishment against these individuals, which means that countries are likely to engage in show of force and far worse actions against, for example, their current invasion of Gaza or like the current invasion of Ukraine, to show that they won't step away from the sanctions of like sporting committees and stuff like that, which actually result in us flipping their arguments on their toes. Moving on to what we tell you in opening opposition, we tell you that this results in worsening international relations. Opposition's only response is tell you that resentment is channeled toward the government of that country instead of the international community. But like, step out of this debate and think really intuitive here, right? Is the average person going to support international community that's probably being demonized by the media and the propaganda, or support a country which they've been living in for the past 20, 30 years? Of course, they're going to hate the international community. And I think the impact of this is significant because not only do international relations worsen, but also like we're telling, like the people pressure that is important to, for example, force these countries to withdraw from their invasion, whatever, now do not exist when the international community has been demonized. Moving on to weighing and to demonstrate to you why we ultimately win this debate against not only opening, but against like the rest of closing. First of all, opening government just provides an argument where there's no actual practical consequences. We actually provide reasons to why our practical, there's like actual practical changes. For example, worse acts of people. For example, life is far worse for the average citizen of these countries who are now demonized by the media. Ultimately, this is an ineffective and useless emotion that only results in more pain and more suffering. So proud to negate. Thank you.
Let's give you the practical consideration that opening opposition wants so badly. Because the Olympics is truly a very practical thing. Countries spend billions of dollars trying to host the Olympics because it brings their country into the limelight. Just like how China wanted to host the Olympics, the Winter Olympics in Beijing, even though they literally had a humanitarian crime like a little bit away from the actual venue. Those are the saliency and like the amount of reputational greatness that the Olympic gives you is so much and gives you so much soft power and even hard power as a country that it outweighs all of those things. Their like soft push on how like, oh, we're actually able to help these victims, the most vulnerable actors in this debate, by having the Olympics is simply false. Couple things in the speech then. Firstly, on a couple points of rebuttal. Secondly, on a couple things of reframing. And then finally on impacting. Firstly, I want to again emphasize to you that the Olympics is not just any other sports event. It is not the World Cup, it is not the Premier League. Those only have a couple countries, and not even countries, but rather like individual teams that they are representing, right? But the Olympics, no thank you, literally every single country and every single sport, its international implications are far more than anything else. So athletes are unlikely going to try to expose certain things. And even then, with the like Qatar World Cup, I didn't hear about anything in terms of like the humanitarian abuses. All I heard about was how like good looking Jude Bellingham looked like. That's the kind of news that goes around when you think about soccer, and when you think about those kinds of events, there's no reason why it's going to be even better. We think then instead what would have created more controversy is, for example, if Qatar was unable to hold the World Cup and it was canceled, the World Cup, or they were unable to hold the World Cup because of the things that the humanitarian abuses that were considered there. We think that that is the practical implication. That's when people start talking, and that's when individuals get outraged. Couple things again here then. But secondly, we also think we want to point out to you just how dehumanizing it is for the victims of these humanitarian crimes to see on TV that the nation that stole their land, shot guns at their families, and raped their women are being celebrated, and people are singing their national anthem at the parade, that they are being proud of their country, even though they are the ones that silent, especially given that a lot of these victims are not actually represented in the Olympics. For example, a lot of religious minorities like the Rohingya group in Myanmar, they don't have like an official like Olympics team. They are unable to get that opportunity to voice their experiences like the official representatives of Myanmar would. So instead, they are continuously silenced, and they're unable to do anything about it, while everybody else is like raving about how like amazing their athletes are and how great their country is, proud of they are of their country. No thank you. But thirdly, we do also agree that it's not the citizens' fault that this is happening, but it's just precedent that individuals are punished for the actions of their country all the time and accepted. For example, it takes people in Russia a lot longer to get a visa to go to the United States, even if they are not complicit, or even if they are not directly involved with the Russian war on Ukraine. Those are the kinds of things that we're willing to do just because we care about the victims of Ukraine and the victims of these humanitarian abuses far more than, for example, not being able to take a trip to the US to go to Sephora, or for example, not being able to compete in the Olympics. At the end of the day, it's just a sport. We think that we want to weigh the lives of these individuals and these vulnerable people far more than just this sport. I don't think that even this punishment is that bad in comparison to literally dying and like having all of everything that you know taken away from you. Before moving on, sure, I'll take that POI.
Would you not say it's more dehumanizing for the victims so a random sports player is banned instead of actual punishment being done against people who are actually executing these poor human rights abusers?
Well, obviously, the best outcome would be for the punishment to be inflicted on the dictator or the person doing this. But we want to tell you, and here's where the practical thing comes along, that it's the Olympics that is going to be the vehicle for this change. We think that as long as you are celebrating these kinds of Olympians and therefore celebrating their country, and note here again, like the Olympics is like very uniquely where an athlete is a representative of their entire nation, that's when like we're able to get that change. We think that on your side, you never tell us on how how you're able to, for example, get the dictator to do these kind of things, except that very loose, like, oh, like it will attract attention. But who really is looking at like the humanitarian abuses that are going on in, like, for example, France, when you have your favorite Olympians that are competing? That's simply unrealistic, has like one line of like very loose mech. We just don't understand. But finally, we also want to tell you that their other alternative was like boycotting the country. But boycotting the country would be literally removing them from the Olympics. If you want to boycott the country, then just boycott them from the Olympics, because then you remove their ability to gain attention. You remove their ability to like gain, like garner, like, for example, glory for their country. But moving on then, for example, also in terms of their point of like worsening international relations, on how like the individuals within the country are going to now hate the international community and like become like more nationalistic, we don't think so, because this isn't like the 1970s. We think that government propaganda is far less salient because of things like the internet and social media. And assuming that most people believe that humanitarian crimes are morally abhorrent, citizens are likely to see like, oh wait, oh, my country is getting banned from the Olympics, or like, oh, we're not allowed to attend the Olympics this year because we literally eliminated 48 like entire families from existence. Like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. I think that's like pretty valid. How about we try to get our government to stop something? But no, thank you. Moving on to our extension then, we think that the reason why we're able to get practical change then, and beyond just a principle level of like national pride and like being proud, we think that them not being invited to the Olympics is not going to significantly impact the well-being of the citizens of the country, but it can significantly impact the perception of the country and the attention that the humanitarian crisis is getting in the media. We think that the opening government just talks about how it shifts attention, but they generally end here. But why does this attention matter so much? Not only is it just about the kind of awareness that is being spread, but also we think when the country is not allowed to participate in the Olympics, then the country is likely to lose legitimacy and therefore, crucially, lose things like investment, lose things, for example, their standing in terms of the UN, or in terms of what other countries want to engage with them, because the Olympics and participating in the Olympics is such a big like show of legitimacy and whether you are a country or not. Just like how, for example, we also think that the Olympics is often likely to take away attention from the like humanitarian abuses that are happening in these countries. For example, for how the support for Gaza was booming in the spring, but the international but for example, after the Olympics happened, a lot of attention was stripped away from that. We think that on our side, the way that we create more attention then is the international controversy and the discussions that happen when a country is not allowed to be in the Olympics creates a conversation that is far, far more likely to create a change in their country than just simply brushing it under the rug. For all these reasons, so proud to propose.
Every sports athlete's dream is to go Olympics and compete. Every people's dream is to stop inhumane acts. I don't know why government keep saying that athletes should be responsible for those inhumane acts, while he or she don't know, we don't know he or she actually thinks and do actually athletes support these inhumane acts at the very get-go. Before I move on to my setup and about 3 and 4 extensions, I'll first rebut to both OG and CG. I have 3 points to rebut OG. So first, they mentioned about the importance of their argument of like banning athletes from Olympics by giving Olympics is dividing attention from those countries' inhumane acts. However, we can see #FreePalestine a lot in social media posts and global sports events. That means we don't actually assume that the Olympics or big sports events will divide attention easily. Even though Israel is not banned in most of the sports events, #FreePalestine is a very famous and important and also very popular hashtag online. Also, they kept mentioned in this debate about Qatar workers. However, this is not actually relevant in this debate because it is a motion about athletes, not the country which is holding the Olympics or sports events. And number 2, it is not actually benefiting government side, because Russia holding Olympics would not be happen, or like Qatar or like Israel holding Olympics will not happen in this status quo, because crimes will eventually block them at the very beginning from being a country holding Olympics. Moving on to response to DPM. So they mentioned about it will like for the idea of targeting country, like domestic fans will like can make voice for those countries and make changes. However, they just neglected the international fans who is cheering for the athlete outside of the country, and also mentioned about athletes are having some athletes are promoting those activism, human rights. However, they didn't bring any successful examples in Olympics or bigger sports events. So I want that evidence at least in CG. And finally, for DPM, they mentioned about opposition is harmfully undermining the honor of Olympics and mentioned the example about Paris Olympics as eco-friendly Olympics. However, that is a total wrong example, because Paris Olympics was not an eco-friendly Olympics, but it seemed to be eco-friendly Olympics. So I want that example should be gone in this debate. Moving on to refutation on CG, I have mainly 2 points. So they said about it's a practical, they will give practical considerations, and large money is invested in that, like holding countries and to make a soft power and hard power bigger in the country. However, it also means that superstars or favorite athletes cannot coming up to Olympics, or also making the holding country cannot get enough compensation for their money invested. So that is like kind of making balance between those, so that argument doesn't stand. Also, they mentioned about celebrating those kind of inhumane acted countries. However, there are examples like Son Ki-jung didn't celebrate because of internal conflict of his own nation. So you cannot assume that athletes with those backgrounds will always celebrate and make problems in that case. And also, that will be criticized in the social media a lot. So I don't think that would be a bigger problem. Moving on to our basic setup, because Olympics are the highest level sports competition, every single nation who participate in that sport tries to compete and participate in qualifiers. And because there are also athletes who are only participate in Olympics, we can see best quality game in Olympics. And number 3, 4-year term between each Olympics makes this Olympics need a lot of practice and competition within and out their country really hard to get ticket for the Olympics. Means that athletes use their time, effort while only running for the Olympics. We have to focus on 2 things. 1, can they predict those acts of their own nations? And 2, can they stop certain acts by their effectiveness? And that is the answer from opposition is no. This is why Olympics should allow sports athletes to have same opportunities. Moving on to our first extension about athletes themselves. This is other point from opening opposition. So they deserve more than other athletes because they would have got less support from their nation, because the nation is in conflict that is considered as an inhumane thing, and they will use a lot of resources in that point. So attention will be decreased to the athletes, but they qualified, so they proven their skills. So it means that they should deserve more, not neglected by the Olympics. Number 2, about the brand advertisement. Olympics are the biggest and highest level competition in the world. So many companies or brands are advertising through Olympics with enormous money. Not only for the Olympics itself, certain countries get partnership or advertisement for their brands. Also, superstars get partnership or advertisement from that. Means that the brand or companies will get lost eventually if certain countries or superstars countries is banned from Olympics. And also, they're getting lower reputation, as the government team kindly mentioned, that companies cannot also predict those acts from nations. So I don't think why those companies or brands have to get also lower reputation or loss in economically in this point. This is so important because investment in Olympics or great sports events will be decreased and making a worse environment for both athletes and fans to enjoy those kinds of events. Thirdly, we have argument about effectiveness. I don't know why this kind of banning things are effective enough to make those problems better, because individual restriction cannot actually change the situation. For example, Russia doesn't stop war after their banning on Paris Olympics. I asked CG as at least GW to explain why this can be actually feasible and give mechanism about the process of individual restriction going to the national restriction and changes in the nation. And also, as I mentioned before, loss is totally big compared to the benefits of banning those people. So I think this is not effective enough. Finally, I would briefly mention about the fans, because fans are important actors, and not only fans cheer for their nation's athletes, but also they're cheering for superstars or their own favorite athletes. Means that if their superstars or their own favorite cannot come out, fans will be disappointed, and ultimate loss for Olympics will happen. Also, this is so important because we have to care about fans not getting chance to their favorite athletes or actually competing in the Olympics. I'm very proud to oppose.
I think opposition side is still unsure about the simple message that being able to ban countries, war crime countries, is going to send to the public, and what will happen if you allow these countries, these governments, to be able to let their players in these Olympics, into the Olympics, which are obviously really influential. 3 things that I'll be doing in my speech. First, talking about how we win over OO. Secondly, over CO, and then lastly, over our opening. Firstly, on OO, I just know that a lot of their stuff simply doesn't stand, and they assume that things are inherently bad when they aren't. For example, first, they say how their burden isn't to prove how people that are directly involved in these war crimes to be allowed, is just to defend those who aren't directly involved. 2 things. 1, it doesn't matter if you're directly involved, but by in of itself, you joining the team shows that you're willing to ignore, or at least or forgive those crimes that have happened in your country, whatever your government has perpetuated. You're willing to ignore those and simply still sing your national anthem and stand for your country really loud and proud, right? But even if you maybe innerly aren't don't agree with that, you simply choosing to be on that team means that you are agreeing with that. You could have chosen to not be in that, right? And also, secondly, you're still singing your national anthem when your government is literally hurting other people and another country suffering. I think this just simply shows the priorities of this athlete, right? And it's just simply the moral message that this sends out is just much overweighing over athletes trying to not be directly involved in how they shouldn't be punished. Secondly, they talk about how sports washing doesn't happen because a lot of these countries don't win a lot of medals in this first place. But 2 layers. Firstly, the impact themselves is just so harmful. It doesn't matter if they don't win medals. Them not being removed just means a lot. It just means that all of this justification is a lot. This justifies them being able to commit war crimes, but still be able to do these things like the other nations are able to do. Secondly, especially if they are winning, then we're unsure as to why it's so important that they're still in this Olympic while ignoring what is happening back at home. Especially if, as they say, they aren't even winning medals, right? We're unsure why this minimal, minuscule thing is so much more important than that. Then they talk about how it's unfair. There's birth lotteries, there's events long ago. How is it going to be considered? A couple things. Firstly, I mean, there's probably professionals that will do this well. Important point in today's debate, disagreement and blurry lines over events versus morality. Even at our worst case, if there are unfair lines that draw what is considered fair to ban, we would rather have this kind of disagreement and blurry lines, because this means that at least some countries that should objectively be banned are going to be banned, because it just makes another impact of sending a signal that nations need to be careful with what they do because there might be a blurry line. They talk about how this hurts national unity. We're unsure as to why hurting national unity in this motion is really bad, because we think that conflict is necessary to make a change. If your country is committing a genocide, for example, to another country, why should you guys have patriotism? Why should you guys be all in unity of what your country is doing, right? Then they talk about how sports is a good place to voice stuff. Exactly. So banning them in Olympics is so important. Oh my gosh, did you hear this country got banned from playing the next Olympic? I wonder what happened. I didn't know about it. Let me do some research, right? Because obviously Olympics is a big thing. If they're actively playing, the focus will be on their player, not on the humanitarian abuses. The sport event takes so much more huger impact, right? If banned, they say how horrible signaling effect that everyone they have a horrible signal effect that everyone is involved. Not that people just simply untrue. People are smart enough to realize that not every single person is going to be involved. No one's gonna think this whole entire population is mean people that, right? They tell you how there's more signaling if you're part of the Olympics. Yes, exactly, that you're signaling you're okay, this is all justification. But even if, yes, athletes are not to blame for humanitarian crime, but the Olympics is where athletes uniquely are representing their whole entire nation. That's what makes the Olympics so unique, right? They can still compete in other competitions that are not nation-based, right? If not letting an athlete, the Olympics will save the lives of thousands and even make a dent, a move towards stopping humanitarian abuse. That's a trade-off CG is willing to take. We also told you how there's precedent of countries prioritizing countries and citizens having to have inconvenience because of, for example, sanctions, right? This is the same thing. It's literally fine. Note that this is extremely important because it was the bulk of the entire opposition bench case. But before I move on, how we win over CO, sure, I'll take a POI.
When somebody wins a medal, do people think that athlete is so cool, or do people think, damn, I love Russia?
Exactly. If an athlete is able to win, then you're you're going to look at that kind of I think they will look over at the athlete, which is going to be wrong. And yeah, they think Russia is cool. Like, oh my gosh, like Russia is able to put out these kind of athletes, right? That's going to be the wrong image, the wrong kind of thinking image they should have about that kind of country. Then moving on to CO, right? I think CO is just simply derivative of their opening, right? They say how they're still unsure why athletes should be punished, but we've already rebutted to this. Like, if they want to differentiate themselves from their opening, then they should take our best case and still prove how somehow they can win over best case. We are the only side that show this, that they haven't. Government CG wins, right? Then they say how when we give our practical impacts, they say how superstars or favorite athletes are also holding the country to not get enough money for the investment. I'm unsure exactly what this kind of rebuttal is. If they're talking about how they don't nations don't get return on investment they put into the athletes, I'm unsure why this weighs over the morality and the lives of victims and the message this sends out. Then they talk about how you can get the best quality of athletes. Obviously, we don't want to ban them. Like we said, if we could directly punish the proprietor, people doing them directly, we would. But one, these athletes are showing that they are willing to forgive those and represent the country still who's doing all this. Second, this isn't unique to the Olympics. And thirdly, this alternatives is that the Olympics reaches really influential, sends out a message that war crimes are okay. What are other people, other citizens that are going to commit crimes going to think, right? And their only real extension is about how companies invested so much in advertising and fans. They need to prove why this is so much more important than moral message that they send out. Even if it's because they mean that it should be sports-based, they still haven't proven that. Then lastly, how we win over OG, because I think they do a lot of good job at saying how we shift attention, but they really miss on the practical impacts, which I think OO points out, right? What did we exclusively tell you? We gave you the impacts, what the countries, these banned countries will now do. We told you that they really want to beat Olympics, and that they want therefore how will and why will they make change? Citizens want to see their countries represented in the Olympics, so they're going to lobby for it. They're going to try to change the government so that they change for the better, so they can be represented. Second, your country might be kicked out of other things that you're part of. Or thirdly, economic failure. No one wants to depend on you if you're where countries depend on you for a natural resource. Your economic ties are going to be destroyed, right? There's just a lot of things that Olympics are going to impact that are going to come influence these nations to start actually acting better, right? Even if none of these big impacts happen, we told you that the message of simply banning itself is so important. We tell you it's a vehicle to send out a message. And why is what we say so much more important than our opening? We found the practical impact and changes which OO catches them out on, right? And this is really important than the because nothing is really is actually can take impact is as important as practical changes that can actually be made. And this addresses how the proposed ban would function in the real world and its actual effectiveness to achieve the desired outcomes. And for all these reasons, so proud to be on CG.
Determining whether a country is guilty of crimes against humanity is often legally and politically complex. It requires extensive investigations, trials, consent among international bodies, for example, the Olympian organization and whatnot. The opposition argues that relying on such determinations to exclude countries from the Olympics introduces another level of ambiguity and the risk of unfair or biased decisions. They might suggest that the process could be manipulated by other political interests, leading to inconsistent reinforcement and further politicalization of the games. We think a very, very important point of the debate was if the Olympics could actually effectively send messages. I have a response to this. We think a message is already sent, right? It's like a humanitarian crime. We think a message is sent better through alternative ways. When a humanitarian crime happens, the world already knows about it. You don't need to drag in the Olympics. You don't need to draw in heavily political ideologies into a worldwide celebration where you already have different alternative measures that can effectively isolate a country from the global stage, such as sanctions, right? So I hope I made that clear. We don't need to draw in the Olympics to this very heavily political problem or whatnot. A clash that happened during the whole debate was a clash between moral responsibility of a country versus the political neutrality that the Olympics must take. I have 4 responses to this. First of all, we argue that as the opposition, we argue that the Olympics are fundamentally about international international unity and bringing other people together from all nations, regardless of their political circumstances. The Olympics are one of the few, very few global events where nations can set aside their differences and compete in a very neutral, apolitical stage. Excluding countries would compromise this neutrality and could politicize the games, turning them into a tool for political judgment rather than a celebration of human athletic achievement. Second of all, we argue that the principle of universality is essential to the Olympics mission. The games are meant to be inclusive and they're meant to be universal, providing a platform for all nations to actually compete against each other through fair methods and through fair metrics. Excluding countries based on their government's actions undermines this principle and could lead to a fragmented global sports community where participation is no longer open to all of the subjects. No, thank you. I'll take that in a minute. But they regard political considerations when they bring in those athletes. Third response to this, opposition argues that excluding countries from the Olympics could escalate international tensions rather than actually reducing them, which is the exact opposite of what side government is arguing in today's debate. The affected countries might respond by boycotting the Olympics or forming alternative competitions, leading to a divided international sports community, which is obviously objectively bad. This could lead to broader geopolitical consequences, potentially exacerbating conflicts rather than contributing to their resolution. So the point that I want to make here is that the government's problem and the government's solution is not matching because closing opposition tells you that this can actually escalate the political conflict and this can escalate the global tensions. So I don't think if that's a thing that the government should be pursuing in today's debate. Fourth level of weighing here, we think that banning of country from the Olympics punishes not just the government responsible for those very unhumanitarian crimes against humanity, but also the innocent athletes and the citizens. Many athletes, well, as you all know, spend their entire lives training for the Olympics and denying the chance to compete. No, thank you. I'll take that in a minute. Sorry. Because of actions and eliminating the chance because of the actions imposed by their government is very, very unfair in the perspective of an athlete. This kind of collective punishment contradicts the spirit of individual competition that the Olympics are supposed to embody. And this is when we think this is why the general Olympics, we think that this is why the Olympics exist in general. Another clash that we want to talk about is about the symbolism versus the effectiveness clash. Yeah, we get that closing government really argues about the symbolism clash. Right? Because what does government tell you about this clash? The symbolic act of banning countries guilty of crimes, again, they tell you that the symbolic act, banning countries guilty of crimes against humanity from the Olympics, it reinforces international norms and supports victims, right? They tell us that it upholds the integrity of the games and it demonstrates a commitment to human rights. What does opposition tell you in this case? We think that symbolic actions such as banning countries may not be as effective as government argues in achieving real change. Such measures might entrench the offending regime's power and provoke a nationalistic backlash without addressing the root cause of the problem, which in this case is the government, not the athletes as a whole. Why do we take this case? We argue that banning countries from the Olympics is unlikely to achieve the desired effect of deterring crimes against humanity. Instead of compelling governments to change, such ban might only entrench the regime's position by fostering a siege mentality where the government and its supporters feel isolated from the global stage and being persecuted by the international community. We think that this could reduce the likelihood of international reforms and this can exacerbate the situation to much more drastic levels. And we as a government, no, thank you. And we as a government think that this is highly unethical, highly ineffective in terms of solving this problem. Now, with all of those clashes addressed, we want to tell you specific reasons why closing opposition wins over opening opposition, wins over opening why we know we're opening government, opening opposition, and closing government as a whole. First of all, why do we win over opening government? Opening government, we basically think, although opening government had a really lovely characterization of the problem, we don't think that opening government's problem and solution does not necessarily match. Individual backlash does not equal to country. Individual backlash does not lead to actually the country, like apologizing themselves to the global stage. Where actually governments have the government policy heavily politicizes the Olympics because it brings politics into the Olympics. Because they fail to bring an apolitical Olympic, they fail to provide a correct solution to the problem. Then why do we win over opening opposition? They fail to consider the diverse stakeholders. The only stakeholder opening opposition considered was the athlete, was the countries. Opening opposition considered we consider much more better. What we consider more diverse stakeholders. Then why do we win over closing governments? Trends are changing. People see the athletes as an athlete. The audience is fascinated by the amount of talent that the athlete has, not what their country has committed. And for all these reasons, I have never been more proud to oppose. Thank you.